Hi, I'm Will Webb, and this is Why You Should Watch. In this episode, we're discussing 90s screwball throwback comedy, The Hudsucker Proxy. Joining me for this chat is Arjun Sajip, film writer and programmer whose excellent knowledge of the screwball genre and cinema more broadly really makes for an exciting discussion. And in a change from the usual format, this episode is unabridged, featuring lots more in-depth discussion usually reserved for the podcast version of Why You Should Watch. If you'd prefer to listen to it instead of watching it, no worries. Just head over to the indietrix podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and basically anywhere you listen to podcasts. And one final note before we get into discussion. The central premise and setup of this movie includes a suicide, so if that's a topic which you find it difficult to hear about, I'd suggest steering clear of this episode.
Once upon a time, the American dream was power, wealth, and success. But in the city that never sleeps, the American dream is about to get a wake-up call.
Norville Barnes is fresh off the bus in New York City, 1959, and starts a job in the mailroom of the monolithic Hudsucker Industries on the same day its director commits suicide. Norville is suddenly propelled to the directorship of the company, attracting the attention of ace reporter Amy Archer, who smells a rat. Both are unaware that Norville's change in fortunes is part of a scheme by villainous board member Sidney J Mussburger to buy a controlling interest in Hudsucker Industries, and no one is prepared for the impact of Norville's amazing new business idea, for kids. So that's the introduction to The Hudsucker Proxy, which is the first, I think, American film that's been suggested. We've done one other English language movie, but it's nice to have an old-fashioned American Hollywood movie, and it doesn't get much more old-fashioned or Hollywood than this, I think.
No, it's very much old-fashioned, very much an affectionate homage to so many different kinds of films. I mean, I guess most people have focused on the kind of screwball element, but there are lots of other elements in there. There's kind of visual references to Billy Wilder's The Apartment, to Brazil by Terry Gilliam, even in some of the boardroom scenes, Network from the 80s. So they've kind of spanned a lot of different they've absorbed a lot of different visual influences, and they kind of send them up or perhaps pay really affectionate homage to them in a way that I find very engaging, very enjoyable to watch.
But before we get into that, let's talk about you and how we met, because we have a kind of interesting thing that we did together, right?
Yes, the Barbican days.
So we met on a program run by the Barbican, which, for those not in the know, is a multi-use art centre. I think that's how they refer to it. Sounds a bit more municipal than it is, I think. The Barbican is like a... It's got a cinema, it's got a theatre. I think it has two, technically, theatres. It has a big kind of concert pit. But we were part of something there called Barbican Young Programmers. And what we did was we put on a film festival that was about coming-of-age movies. And that's quite a loose label. It's quite a nice way, basically, of justifying whatever the teens and young people who are involved in it want to put on, basically. So I did it 2 years in a row. I actually attended the year before I did it. I went to go see a screening, and I posted about that on the YouTube channel, which is kind of weird. It's like making my destiny come true. It's nice. It's a little bit less than that because, of course, I had to apply for it. So, but anyway, Arjun, we met in the second year of that, and had quite an interesting festival. Do you remember what we had on in our year?
A few things. I think there was a documentary called For Akeem, which stands out in my mind. I think my favourite film from the festival was one that you and I actually presented, Summer '93, by Carla Simone, I think her name.
Carla Simone, yeah. That's
was
a Catalan film. Really gorgeous.
Really wonderful film.
And I've been kind of awaiting her other film, which is supposedly either shot or shooting, I think pre-pandemic, but we'll have to see. I think it's like set in Mexico, something like that. Okay. I'm quite excited.
Yeah, definitely.
And she's a London trained person too, as well. She went to London Film School.
Okay.
A local talent. She couldn't attend, I think, our screening because she was like super pregnant, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating festival. Obviously, they got really kicked in their teeth like everyone did by COVID. They were supposed to. It usually runs in March, so it was supposed to run the week that everything in the UK shut down. But they've just announced their new program with some really amazing films in it. And in fact, if you are a film goer who lives in London or close enough, then I highly recommend the Barbican. They've just put on Arjun, one of your favorites, is playing there soon, right? Long Day's Journey into Night in 3D.
Yes, I suppose while I'm here, quick chance to plug that, even though I've got nothing to do with it other than just loving it. On the 13th of June, I think, a film called Long Day's Journey into Night by the Chinese director Bi Gan. Amazing film. There's also a play and a film called Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. But this is nothing
not that.
There's nothing to do with that. It just happens to have the same name. And it's a really amazing film. One of the kind of technical things that seems sort of like a gimmick, but I think works wonderfully well and is used really ingeniously and kind of emotionally effectively, is the fact that the second half of the film is in 3D. And not only is it in 3D, but it's a single continuous tracking shot. And a fairly complex one where it kind of, you begin in this mine shaft and then you kind of go up. There are various things that happen in the mine shaft, and you end up kind of rising up and ending up on a mountainside, and then taking kind of zip line to this sort of dilapidated town where this sort of strange otherworldly party is going on. It's really, I can't really put it into words. I can't do justice to it in words, but if you can catch it, really highly recommend it to see what kind of things people are doing with 3D that are really interesting, and also how this guy pulled off this tracking shot that was very complex, but really kind of works far beyond just being a gimmick.
I want to talk about one other thing, which is the other time that me and you have worked together, you worked on Scalarama, which is this amazing, odd kind of festival event type thing that runs across the UK. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit more.
Sure. So a couple of years ago, or maybe 2018 now, I was the editor of a newspaper called Scalarama. And I say newspaper because it's got the kind of format of a big broadsheet, but it is tied to the film festival of the same name. Scalarama is essentially a kind of nationwide, I guess you could call it a festival. It feels more like a sort of movement that takes place every September, and is essentially a way of connecting all these interesting screenings that are taking place all over the country, mostly kind of grassroots screenings that are put together by kind of film exhibition collectives or enthusiasts that either work with cinemas or kind of put up screenings in their own places that they rent, maybe pubs or whatever. And it's wonderful because you get this incredible array of films that really don't get screened very often. Many of them are cult films, quite obscure, but have a very, very devoted, if small, fan base. Some of them are kind of classics that it's great to see again on the big screen, and mostly it caters to, I guess, the film community that is into kind of odd films. Will, I remember that you wrote a great essay about trash cinema.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, just listing off all the weird shit.
It was great to read. It was great to read the kind of such a thoughtful consideration of that. I don't know if you post links under this, but if you want, I can send you the link to the newspaper, which it's using Issue, ISSUU, the kind of newspaper platform thing.
That'd be great.
So that was fun. That was very fun to do.
Yeah, and it's kind of that's kind of the programming focus comes from its namesake, right? Which is the Scala Cinema in King's Cross, actually, not that far from where I live now. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was a very influential cinema in terms of programming when it was around, which I think it lasted about 20 years. And they got shut down by Stanley Kubrick, if I remember correctly. They basically got sued into oblivion by him for showing an illicit copy of Clockwork Orange that he didn't want screened. But it's probably most well known now for the two guys who ran it. One of whom was Nick Powell, who passed away year before, who ran the National Film and Television School and also Virgin with Richard Branson, Virgin Records. The other guy who ran it is Stephen Woolley, who produced plenty of really good films for Neil Jordan in his early part of his career. They were also basically responsible, in a nice tie into this, for the Coen Brothers and Sam Raimi having a profile in the UK, because back when they started off this kind of film label that he was running with Nick Powell, they bought Blood Simple and Evil Dead, if I remember correctly, as well.
I did not know that. That's a great thing to know.
There's my nice tie-in to this, which is the Hudsucker Proxy.
Just got hired today. Entry level. But I got big ideas. When the president and owner of 87% of the company's stock drops, then the company too has a problem. What we need now is a new president. Some jerk. My leg is on fire. We can really push around.
So for those who aren't familiar with the Coen Brothers, they're this mad duo who write and direct their films together. Actually, Joel is doing his first solo project this year. I think it's supposed to come out this year. It's called Macbeth. It's an adaptation of the play, unsurprisingly. And I think they're really well known for this kind of crime stuff that they do. They did Fargo. They did The Big Lebowski, which of course is essentially a crime film in its heart. And they also did, much more serious films like No Country for Old Men. So that's kind of the reputation that they've got. But we're going to cast our minds back to 1994. That's when Hudsucker Proxy came out, right? 94?
Yep.
God, you can tell I've done my research for this. And you're kind of situating them in this interesting point where, like, they are kind of new kids on the block, essentially. So they've done a couple of movies that people really liked, but they've not yet done stuff like Fargo. They're not started winning Academy Awards. This comes just after Barton Fink, which a lot of people have seen. It's a very, like, film studies class movie, I think, because it has lots of plenty of obvious symbolism in it. And then Miller's Crossing as well, which is one of their less seen movies, I'd say. And this was not a successful film when it first came out. It was not. It did not make its money back. It was not critically well liked either. And I think for me, it feels like the kind of forgotten Coen Brothers film.
Yeah, I agree. And it's sort of interesting to read some of the criticism back today, because some of it. I mean, one that sticks out in my mind as both a memorable criticism and one that I kind of don't really think of as a criticism, but I think of almost as a compliment is. I think Jonathan Rosenbaum or someone in Sight and Sound said it's like a Preston Sturges character in a Frank Capra movie with Fritz Lang sets. And I just think, why would anyone not want to see that?
That's the point, right? That's not a problem. That's exactly as designed.
It's crammed. The film is crammed kind of full of tropes in a way that feels kind of, because they don't just present these tropes to you in a kind of tedious way, or in a kind of academic rehashing of these bygone films. It's very much an extremely affectionate and effective way of doing it themselves. If I can quote Ethan Coen himself, let me just get up my document where I made a few notes.
Love this level of detail. Great. Go in, dude.
Ethan Coen is the producer of the film. He produces all the Coen Brothers films. And he said, it's the case where, having seen those movies being the kind of 30s, 40s, 50s films that Hudsucker Proxy is kind of sending up, having seen those movies, we said, they're really fun, let's do one, as opposed to, they're really fun, let's comment upon them. And that really comes across, because in some ways you could look at certain flaws of the film as being kind of unreconstructed flaws that are imported from films of old. Obviously, the opening, I say obviously as if everyone's seen it, but the opening will, as you know, you've seen it, is kind of weirdly fairy tale like in a way that feels like it's been seen a zillion times. You kind of have a slow pan in of a New York skyline that's clearly a kind of composite New York skyline from the 50s. It's not really attempting to be real, but it is attempting to be kind of filmic, and it's snowing. And you've got this voiceover, this kind of slightly hackneyed voiceover from this old black guy that works in the clock tower. And this again is a trope, if I can use this word, because I don't know any other word for it. But
let's just say magical black guy.
Yeah, that's probably the best way of getting around it. Magical black guy trope who kind of is omniscient and is there to kind of further the plot of the white characters. So these kind of tropes are, at the beginning, you're kind of like, all right, this is a great opening, but is it just going to be an old-fashioned fairy tale film? And I think the reason the film got me sort of almost from the get-go was the music. They use Khachaturian's Adagio from Spartacus, which is not a piece I'd come across before, though I think it has been used in certain other films. And it's one of the most grand, gorgeous, beautiful pieces of classical music or any music that I've ever heard. And their use of that music, I think, elevates what could be pastiche into something that's really quite grand and has a real sweep and a real kind of emotional impact, especially if you see it in the cinema. I was lucky enough to have first seen it on the big screen in the Prince Charles. And I think seeing it on the big screen really goes...
They screen it every Christmas, right? Because it's technically a Christmas film.
It's sort of, yeah. It's set on New Year's Eve. Well, actually, it's set in December, but the film opens on New Year's Eve, 1958, going into 1959,
Yeah.
and it's sort of a New Year's film. So maybe they screen it on 31st of December. I actually don't know. I haven't. I don't think I saw it as part of a kind of seasonal screening. I think they were doing a screening
Right.
of certain other films. But it's one of those films where it's really worth seeing big because the set design is phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's really, in fact, viewers of the film might recognize some of the sets from other films because, as a lot of people may know, oftentimes these sets are constructed and then they get thrown on the fire after the studio and the film is done with them, and they never get seen again, no matter how amazing they are. But these sets actually went on to be, they were about to be thrown on the fire before, I think, this is a Warner Brothers film, and then Universal were like, oh, we're doing this film. I can't remember what the film was, but they were like, oh, we could really do with those sets. Let's use those, and then we'll throw them away. And then they used them, and they turned out to be, really good for the purposes. And then Warner Brothers actually rented those sets back, the sets that they'd previously owned, for doing, I think, the Batman films. They did the Joel Schumacher Batman films, Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, classics of the genre. And then I think the sets went on to be used for Godzilla, and some of them were even used for Independence Day. So they had a really surprisingly long-lasting shelf life, as it were.
That's a kind of fascinating thing. I mean, the Batman thing is a really interesting point, because I think about the interesting thing for me in the art direction of this film is how cleverly they mesh different architectural styles and eras together. And I think the Joel Schumacher Batman films in particular have this really interesting, odd architectural sense where they're mixing Gothic and Art Deco and all this stuff with neon. And I think, it would definitely fit this stuff. But anyway, before we get into the weeds on it, we're going to just draw back and situate the film, as you were saying, in those kind of references. The Coen Brothers are kind of on record as saying that their film experience as kids was watching film noirs, screwball comedies, and westerns on TV at home, and occasionally getting to go out to cinema and see them. And I think of their films as being conversations between each other about the films they like in some ways. And that explains the weird mix of genres they have, like having a kind of Raymond Chandler-esque detective story filtered through stoner comedy and screwball in Big Lebowski, for instance. So this is very much a screwball pastiche on its surface. I think the plot is very much laid out like that. You mentioned Preston Sturges, who they obviously love and they talk about all the time. Other films that it is related to is His Girl Friday. It's very much like that in terms of its dialogue, which is extremely fast-paced.
Yeah.
And there's, as you say, a big debt owed to Frank Capra, because there are these magical elements to the film as well. I don't want to spoil the movie because there's some wild stuff that goes on in it, but the opening is a good example, with that long push in, this sort of magical sense too. And I think for me, the stuff I love about the film and the stuff I don't like about it comes from that pasticheness. It's interesting that you were saying, like, they wanted to make a film like that, not a film about that. And I think that's what makes it work in the end. A lot of these kind of pastiches and stuff like that feel reverent, and there's nothing really reverent about this movie. It's irreverent all the time. And you can see that in the setting, which is, as you were saying, is quite clever. So I noticed in a number of reviews, people were annoyed that the fashion and the kind of set design was from the 30s. They were parodying these films from the 40s, and then all of the references culturally were to the 50s.
50s, yeah.
And there was a real oh, well, this isn't consistent. Like, what's the point there? But that seems to me to be exactly the design, right? They're building this fantastical setting that feels oldie-worldy. And what you're saying about this miniature skyline that you start the film off on is a really good point, because, of course, they had the option to make an accurate city skyline for New York, but instead they kind of, I think the designer said they took all of their favorite buildings from New York and just put them in one block.
Yeah.
And that was the idea with it, which is fantastic. And so that was something that really shook me about the film, because I obviously have heard about this film before, but not seen it. And I wasn't expecting that extremely heightened feel from it, which was a nice surprise. I really like Raising Arizona, which is one of their earlier films and is very madcap and kind of goofy in the same way. And I always remember feeling like, I wish there was more of this. And this is that. This is them making that. Of course, the bad response to this is probably why they didn't make any more. But what are you going to do? And the thing that it really did feel like to me at times is Brazil, which you mentioned as well, the Terry Gilliam film. One example is that when he joins the company, there's this gigantic incredibly hectic mailroom at the bottom, which feels exactly like the office where Jonathan Pryce works in Brazil, even down to the kind of the dolly moves and stuff like that. And yeah, you have this wonderful wide-angle cinematography with Roger Deakins as well. Like everything in the film is shot very wide, and it gives a sense of these big, oppressive spaces, these gigantic boardrooms and stuff that everyone seems to occupy. So I had a really nice experience watching this film with the first experience of that heightened tone with the arrival of the blue letter.
Yes, so that's a great sequence. It comes quite early on in the film. So to set the scene a little bit more, Norville Barnes, who's the protagonist, played by Tim Robbins, is sort of the hapless mailroom guy that's just, it's his first day on the job, and he's completely surrounded by this almost steampunkish, hectic mailroom that he's kind of been plunged into, that is kind of like Terry Gilliam, some parts Terry Gilliam, some parts almost like Orson Welles as The Trial, in the sense that it's like, what is going on? Everything is so big and everything is so confounding. And then shortly after he's been sort of bombarded with instructions that are Kafkaesque, the film kind of stops for a second, and you see this man marching all the way down this incredibly long hallway, the center of the mailroom, kind of brandishing this blue letter. And the film kind of focuses for a while on just the sheer length of this guy's journey, all the way from the entrance of the mailroom to where Norville is kind of haplessly standing, because everyone else has scurried away. But Norville is, the buffoon that doesn't really know what's going on. And so he is entrusted with delivering this blue letter to Sidney J Mussburger, who, as Will mentioned, is played by Paul Newman. He's a kind of the big head honcho of Hudsucker Industries. After Hudsucker himself commits suicide very early in the film. And so you've got this wonderful sequence where Barnes has to take this blue letter to Mussburger, and you see him go to the secretaries that are kind of guarding Mussburger's office, and she says, "Do you have an appointment?" And there's this kind of like almost musical sequence where, she's like, "If you had an appointment, it would be in the book." And there's this gigantic book, and everything about this film is just so huge. All the props, all the sets, they're just so kind of magnificently enormous, in obviously a way that could be quite depressing in certain directors' hands intentionally, but obviously the Coen Brothers are using it for comedy, and so the size of it is both beguiling and very funny. And eventually he finds his way in, because he shows the blue letter, and basically one of the women faints, and the other is basically fanning her.
It's this kind of cap on the sequence, isn't it? Where he shows the blue letter off when they finally get to the point of like, I don't have an appointment, I have a blue letter.
Yeah.
And there's this tremendous dolly move in on this woman just standing on like a ladder, I think. She's like filing something, and she just screams when she sees it. Just like screams out loud and faints, which is just a fantastic, just a really outrageous thing.
Do you have an appointment?
No.
Shall we look in the book? We don't seem to be in the book. If we had an appointment, we'd be in the book.
I have this, here it is.
And it was interesting what you're saying about those sets being almost depressing, except they end up being funny in that context. It is a dark comedy in certain ways. I think it starts with a suicide. It can't be anything other than that. But for me, and you mentioned it early on, the score is really what makes it manage that tone really well. There's this wonderful kind of magpieing of classical cues as well as their own music in the score. And it lends this kind of ethereal or maybe supernatural kind of tone to the proceedings, I think. It's an interesting thing because I think a couple of their movies have this energy, and particularly early on as well. One example is in Raising Arizona, where they're pursued by this kind of otherworldly biker who's just like tremendously evil, so much so that when he rides down the road, plants set on fire kind of spontaneously behind him. And that's like carried on. You see it in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou as well, where the sheriff is sort of always associated with these massive floods and this kind of tremendous sense of fire and water.
And Barton Fink, of course, when John Goodman walks down the corridor.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's interesting because I think that drops off in their movies. It's not in all of them by a long shot. And it is a Preston Sturges thing or a Frank Capra thing, where it's about these kind of slightly fantastical elements that draw stuff together. And I think it gives the film enough pathos as well, just to make it function as a movie in its own right. Because it is because of the comedy and the way they're trying to portray those older movies, it does verge right on the edge of being like, I don't care about any of this because it's just, it's just like style. But I think they managed to just like manage that tone really well.
Absolutely. It's interesting what you mentioned about the wide-angle lens as well, because the wide-angle lens was used in Raising Arizona pretty extensively, but in certain other films like Miller's Crossing, they went for a kind of a longer lens, and they use the wide-angle lens really effectively for comedy. And it doesn't mean they're kind of like moving the camera in your face all the time, and capturing so much, and it's just such a kind of madcap panorama of insanity. It's wonderful.
It's another Terry Gilliam feel. I think that bit in the mailroom in particular feels a lot like Brazil, because it's this like very wide lens as it's like a tracking shot, and it feels very much like that sequence in Brazil. And it's funny too to think of this as being Roger Deakins, who I don't associate. You would no longer really do we associate that style with his work. I think he's kind of migrated quite far away from that now. But yeah, it's interesting to think of that. And I guess in talking about stylization, we should talk about the performances of the film as well. So the big person who we haven't talked about any yet, who I think has the most stylized performance by far, is Jennifer Jason Leigh.
Definitely.
Who plays ace reporter Amy Archer, who's just this intensely grating, super fast talking reporter. And I think that's about as stylized as the performances get. Paul Newman does a good job of sort of feeling a bit more realistic as a character, and I think Tim Robbins is somewhere in between. You said he was standing like aimlessly at one point in the scene. That's most of what he does in the movie, sort of stand aimlessly. But he's wonderful, and he does have a real skill for kind of making characters who wouldn't be likable in that context. But yeah, her performance is the most screwball-y by far. There's this sequence where she's sat in the newspaper offices reading out crossword clues that she's making up as she's writing her article, and it's a good example of that. And for me, I think this is the only bit of the film where I feel like that feels more like an impersonation sometimes than a performance. Although it's interesting to see it, and I think it's interesting because the character is to an extent creating that for herself, and it does fall away a bit as the movie carries on. So there's an extent to which that's intentional.
That's a great point. Certainly, I think when I first saw the film, I mean, I should disclose at this point that I'm a massive Katherine Hepburn fan, and so anyone that kind of impersonates that unique transatlantic weird accent with a kind of fast talking dame who takes no nonsense from anyone already has my vote. So the first time I saw it, I guess I was so spellbound by the film. I didn't really criticize it. I think on subsequent viewings, I've now seen it 3 times. Each time certain cracks start appearing. For example, her accent is not consistent at all. Sometimes it kind of lapses into a weird kind of Alabama/Georgia accent for a few words. And other times, I guess she's just trying to do too much. It's a really game performance. She really does try and commit herself, but it doesn't quite always come off because she's trying to mix the accent with the kind of fast talkingness, with the wit, with the kind of hand movements that are like, almost like a Bollywood dance sometimes. And it's certainly a noble attempt. It doesn't always come off. And so if we are talking about performances, I guess hers is both one of the most enjoyable, but also one of the ones where you see the most cracks.
Yeah, I think it's the bit of the movie where you can't get away with over stylizing stuff is performance, and I think for her one is the problem. It's funny about the accent thing. I actually thought that was on purpose. I thought that was like that she had also come from some small town somewhere and then kind of made up this hard-boiled persona for it. But maybe I'm just reading too much.
No, I think that's a good point. Interesting what you said also about it falling away over the course of the film. I hadn't noticed that.
Maybe it was just because I got used to it. I don't know. I have also been watching a lot of Gilmore Girls recently, which I feel like is a very good way, like a good example of taking that kind of screwball-y dialogue style and turning it into something that makes a bit more sense to a modern audience. Because they talk tremendously fast in that, and the scripts for Gilmore Girls for like an hour-long show, so usually it's like a page a minute, but they were having like 90-page scripts because they were just like rattling through dialogue so quickly in it. And I think that's an interesting comparison to make. I'll talk about Gilmore Girls whenever I can, and I'm sure people listening to the podcast have heard me talk about it before. But yeah, it's interesting to see it, and especially to compare it versus Paul Newman, I think in particular, who actually I think it's a great performance from him, where he manages to be, he puts quite a lot of richness into what is essentially a flat villain, because he doesn't really change his mind at any point during it, but he's tremendously dynamic in terms of showing that kind of interior thinking process. Early on, when he gets given the blue letter, he immediately starts dressing Norville down like really badly before realizing, oh, this is actually a great stooge. and then he almost turns back in on it when he's like, oh, actually, maybe I won't go for you. And then there's this incredible slapstick sequence, but it's quite a dynamic thing that they get to do. And I think it's also worth saying that, the Coen Brothers' biggest skill to me by far is their scripting. And I think their screenplays are very good, often strange, but very good. And there's a tremendous script for this. It's incredibly funny, even in places where it doesn't feel like obvious gags. There's another bit in the mailroom when they announce the death of Hudsucker, the guy who runs the company, and they describe him as having merged with the Infinite at like 12:09 Hudsucker time, and it's just such a clever, like weird Kafkaesque way of phrasing everything is great. I also love that they managed to go out of their way to never explain what it is that Hudsucker does as a company.
Yeah.
It's not really clear, except for the fact that halfway through they just start to manufacture children's toys, and it's not clear that ever was something that they were going to do anyway. So, yeah. Oh, we shouldn't talk about that because I think it's quite nice to not get a spoiler on what that thing is. It's a shame that that's the main image for the film.
Promotional
gives away maybe its best joke. Yeah. Because it is I was aware of that as a plot thing before I knew anything about the film, and so. It's a real shame that it's given away because it is a great joke and they really hold it in their back pocket until the point where it should land.
Yes. Yeah, I think that really frustrated them. That it was, but I'm not sure they had much say over the promotional materials really. And I suppose it feels like an iconic sequence. You mentioned the screenplay is wonderful, and it absolutely is. It's one of their screenplays where they actually co-wrote it with someone. In this case, Sam Raimi of SpiderMan reboot fame, or the pre-reboot. I don't even know what number of reboot that reboot was.
I think we're 2 reboots down the line now from there. Yeah.
Good Lord.
That was the original Spider-Man. That's the way to talk about it now. It's the original Spider-Man film. Except there was actually 2 Spider-Man films made for TV in the 70s. But anyway.
Okay. And well, you also...
They're terrible. Don't watch them.
Of Evil Dead fame as well, Sam Raimi. And in fact, Bruce Campbell from the Evil Dead movies is in the Hudsucker Proxy as one of the journalists. None of the journalists are really as good as Amy Archer, the fast-talking dame, but they provide good comic relief. And so Sam Raimi actually directs one of the sequences in the Hudsucker Proxy. You seem to be shying away from spoilers, understandably, so I'm not going to go too deep into what the sequence is, but it's a central sequence in the film, and perhaps its most well-known and iconic. And it's directed with his kind of his customary visual panache and sense of humor and dynamism.
Oh, is this the invention of Norville's device?
Yes, the invention and the role.
Right. Okay. Interesting. I didn't know that was by him.
Yeah, he actually has a cameo role as well in as one of the brainstormers.
It's strange to think about now, but they were really good mates, and they actually lived together at the time that the film was written. So it's like the Coen Brothers and then Sam Raimi just like sharing a flat somewhere. And there's this kind of like cross period where they're really synergized with each other. I think Joel Coen, I can't remember if it's Joel or Ethan, but one of them edited a number of Raimi films. He made a film that's really not well known called Crime Wave that was written by them. And in some ways shares a lot with this film, although this is a much more successful kind of version of the same idea. And they have quite a close working relationship. You'll notice that Ted Raimi is in some of the Coen Brothers films and vice versa. So yeah, it's interesting to see that this is a movie that really melds their sensibilities. I think when you watch like Spider-Man 2 has a lot of like Hudsucker energy, I think, in terms of sort of like screwball-y romance stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
So I wanted to share with you before we move on to talking about kind of individual scenes and moments in the film to recommend it. I wanted to share a review with you and get your thoughts on it, because it's really interesting to me watching this now that it had such a bad critical reaction at the time. I think there's a lot of stuff that there's a lot of like interesting stuff in the movie, and the extent to which it works, I think, probably dependent on taste. But I don't think it's a bad film. I think people would be very wrong to call it a bad film. So this is a review from the man himself, Roger Ebert, in 1994 on the release of the film.
Yes.
He has an interesting device for this review. He's like, I have an angel on one shoulder and a demon on my other shoulder, and they're going to tell me, and they basically like devil's advocate about the film. But this is kind of pulled from that. He said, "This is the best looking movie I've seen in years, a feast for the eyes and the imagination. But the problem with the movie is that it's all surface and no substance. Not even the slightest attempt is made to suggest that the film takes its own story seriously. Everything is style." So this is the kind of typical one of the typical critical responses to films, which is it's style over substance.
Mhm.
And I got to tell you that I've never really understood that as a criticism for stuff. I get that some movies don't have impact. I think that's problematic, but I think style can have an impact all of its own. And ultimately, a movie is just about transporting us to somewhere else. You can tell that I'm a big Argento fan because this is my opinion on films. I don't think they really need a plot or anything like that to function. Although I like a good plot, don't get me wrong. And yeah, I think it's an interesting take on this movie that the style is the problem, when I think that's the whole aim. And I think they would read you and think, yeah, spot on, totally agree.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So I read that review last night, and I was struck by the fact that it's certainly a very interesting way of constructing a review. You basically just have, an angel telling you, here are the good bits, and then the devil being like, well, it was bad for this reason, yada, 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 or vice versa. And at the end, he basically said, so he, as many of you may know, Roger Ebert, Chicago-based film critic, would always give films marks out of 4. So he'd give 4 stars. That was like his ultimate rating. And he ends up giving this 2. So he splits it down the middle. He basically splits the difference between the angel and devil and is like, okay, fine, well, ultimately. But he ends it on a note of almost as if the Coen Brothers are going to read it and take it on board and be like, I'm giving you 2 because, it is a good film, but I feel you need to dial down the style a bit, which almost made it sound like it was a kind of, this is a critique of their films in general. And so you're sort of tired of that, and you kind of want them to expand a bit more, which is kind of interesting because critics obviously see themselves as in dialogue with filmmakers, and this is an interesting way of basically saying, like, we recognize that you have promise, but why don't you try and use this promise in a sort of different way? But I wonder if that criticism would first of all apply if you hadn't seen any of their films before, or if you've seen their films and you love their films and you love their style and you love the fact that they are kind of masters of certain genres, like Miller's Crossing, for example, a kind of really impressive genre exercise in a way that kind of only the Coens could really do. So is it really a valid criticism? Maybe also you could say that he was writing in the early 90s, and maybe by this point there was a lot of cinema that was style over substance. Obviously, you've got early Tarantino, which I'm not sure what Ebert thinks about it, but a lot of people have noticed that he is a man that is ultimately style over substance. Over time, his cinema has shown that. Whether or not that's a good or bad thing, that's up for debate. But the fact is, he's a style man, and stylization was very much a kind of thing that was, directors were kind of developing these hallmarks. So yeah, it is. I agree with you that it's kind of odd that they take up the style as a criticism, and maybe it was a function of that being the Coen Brothers' hallmark or the hallmark of a lot of cinema at the time. But certainly these days, to see a film like that is like the Hudsucker Proxy is very rare. You don't get many films that are such expensive and handsome sort of retellings and recapturings of this bygone cinematic age. It just isn't really a thing anymore. Well, can you watch many movies? Can you think of any films that kind of try and mimic that style while also doing a great job of capturing a lot of what made those movies great?
No, I think it's really singular. I mean, obviously Hollywood likes a film about Hollywood, and you only have to look back at the Oscars to see stuff like Mank getting nominated this year, where it's like, wow, how brave. A movie about Hollywood by people of Hollywood. Who knew? The only thing that Hollywood people think is important. But I think this film is different to those to some extent because it is so irreverent. It's making fun of or with those movies. And it also helps, I think, that source material was very prominent at one point, and then now isn't very well known. You don't normally see people talk a lot about film noir. They don't talk so much about Screwball. So it's an interesting thing. It's weird that Ebert gave that a bad review for being over stylized when he gave Dark City such a good review. Considering that Dark City is also a 1940s throwback film that uses extensive miniature work and big built sets to parody or pastiche, albeit for much more dramatic purposes. Bit of a strange point from Ebert.
Looking for consistency in Ebert reviews is very much needle in the haystack exercise.
So is it Ebert or Ebert?
Because I don't know. Could be Ebert.
This is not good. I've got to watch that movie about his life. Otherwise, I've been walking around like an absolute plum for centuries.
No, you could well be right. I don't think I've ever heard it. I think I've only read it. So you're probably right there.
I feel like style was being pushed back against a lot in the 90s, whereas now we have very austere movies. Because if you read if you read contemporary critical reactions to Terry Gilliam's later work, there's a lot of oh, this is too stylized. And then now we look back and think, well, actually, this is kind of great in its own way.
You mean like The Fisher King, things like that?
Yeah, exactly. And like 12 Monkeys was kind of viewed as being a bit decadent. I think that came out 2 years before this, so which is funny because I think that's one of his better movies, very very contained for Gilliam. I think the bigger issue for the Coens in particular is that this came right after, Miller's Crossing, which is pretty straight down the line. Like as you say, a genre exercise. It's pretty like focused.
Though even that has
like,
pastiche elements.
Yeah, but they're more like in the screenplay, I think,
Yeah.
more than they are like these visual pastiches.
Yes.
Because their scripts are always like pastiche. They always reference something. I think Fargo is probably their most sort of original story. No Country for Old Men also is pretty much.
Yeah. And in Fargo, they're pastiche people and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And then also the other film that they'd done before this was Barton Fink, which is also really stylized, but I think in a way that appeals more to film critics because it's very static and it's very symbolic. So it's serious stylization, which seems to be okay. You're allowed a visual symbol, but you're not allowed to have fun.
That's a great point. It's a great way of looking at it.
I was just fresh out of watching. It was my birthday a couple of days ago, so I get one movie pass a year. Thank you. I get one pass a year to make my girlfriend sit down and watch a movie with me that I like, and I don't have to justify to her. We watch mostly films that I like because I watch a lot of films, and I only want to show her the good ones.
Yeah.
But we watched Deep Red, Argento's classic giallo, probably his best giallo, always most consistent one. And it's wild just how much of that film is just like cheeky and sort of having fun with the conventions of the movie. So I think I should declare my bias. I'm very much a kind of style isn't a problem filmmaker, which again is weird because my films, when I make films, are pretty serious and kind of austere. I don't like moving the camera too much. So yeah, it's interesting that I like these kind of movies, but very good fun.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that it was incredibly expensive. It was the Coen Brothers' most expensive film at the time. I think you couldn't make a film so stylized and so successfully stylized without a big budget.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It was like $25 million. It went over budget, I think, slightly. And it was the first time they'd got sort of serious money to play with. Weirdly, off the back of Barton Fink, which is not... It did very well at the Cannes Film Festival. It won the Palme d'Or and like 2 other major awards. I think Best Director, Best Actor. So, I mean, I think Barton Fink was actually the last time that happened, or maybe it was a time where the Cannes people, the Cannes organizers were like, we can't just let one film sweep the board. It's fine in the Oscars, but at Cannes, we do not do this. We do not do this. But it's weird because you watch Barton Fink and it's not the kind of film where you think, these guys are going to make me a lot of money. So part of it, I think, must have just been a faith thing, a kind of a passion project, and just being like, these guys really love cinema, and maybe their love for cinema will pay off, and they'll transmit it to the people, and people fall in love with what they do.
I don't even know if there was like a conscious thinking behind that spending of money to some extent. Like, I think they were partially hoping that they would just fall in line with a Hollywood type movie. Because if you look at the casting decisions, they originally wanted Tom Cruise for the lead, which is, I mean, actually, as it turns out, Tom Cruise is funny. So I think that could have worked, but I don't think he would have done he can't be this kind of like lovable idiot like Tim Robbins can be. I can't imagine Cruise doing a good job of that.
No.
And reading that, you just think like, well, you guys just wanted someone who was an award winner on your books, and you were willing to pay $25 million for it. Yeah, it is necessarily a big budget film too, because they wrote the movie about 10 years before, and they didn't make it because they didn't have enough money. And that would have been about the time when Crime Wave was being made. This Sam Raimi film that has a lot of similar elements to it that just bombed, and was also a big budget movie for him relative to what he'd done previously, which was no budget movies. So yeah, I think they kind of took their lessons from that, and still didn't really manage to find something commercially viable there. It's also weird. I don't like Barton Fink that much. I think out of all of their movies, it's probably my least favorite. Oh no, I mean, obviously I'm ignoring like Lady Killers, stuff like that.
You mean they're respected films. It's your least favorite.
Yeah, the films that people like of theirs. I think that Barton Fink is everything that this movie isn't, in the sense that it's a really stiff and overly reverential movie in lots of ways. It just doesn't work for me in the same way. So yeah, I always find it a bit wild that people love Barton Fink as much as they do. And now having seen this, I'm like, well, why not this movie?
Yeah. It's weird. Barton Fink is funny because they wrote it as a kind of they were struggling with writing Miller's Crossing, which for those who haven't seen it, definitely worth watching if you like film noir or gangster films or any films with a kind of complex plotting and mysterious characters. But because the plotting of Miller's Crossing is so labyrinthine, presumably they started struggling some months in, and so they thought, okay, well, we're going to take some time out. Let's write Barton Fink, because this is an idea that had been germinating in their mind for some time. And they wrote Barton Fink almost as a kind of like seamless process. And they made it sound like it was a kind of pleasure to write. It was very easy. But at the end, when I watched it, I saw it earlier this week for the second time. I just thought, it doesn't really feel like a finished product, or it feels, like they haven't really put that much thought into it. It almost does feel like a sort of dashed off exercise. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but it's funny that it takes itself very seriously and that others take it so seriously, when it's sort of clearly a film that they, almost a film that they wrote for fun, for themselves, rather than necessarily for an audience.
I think for what it's worth, Barton Fink is kind of the beginning of, and for a while, the most distilled version of a theme that comes up a lot in their work that's now become probably the main theme of their work. And I think that's I think about the Coen Brothers as having like early Coens, and then it ends when they start doing weird shit like Lady Killers, and there's this odd interregnum. And then they've gone back into critical favor with these much slower, gloomier films. And even films like Hail Caesar have this as its main theme, which is the idea of like, that the universe is some kind of inherently cruel place that nevertheless has some kind of weird magic to it. So there's this kind of like fatalism. A Serious Man is the one that really like lays this out in a big way, where it's like this Jewish mystical sort of like fatalism about the world, that like everything is about suffering, but also that like you can't really change anything, so you've got to appreciate the absurdity of it. And you see that in Hail Caesar, where for what it's worth, nothing that happens in the film ends up having any impact, and it all goes back to being the same the next day. And I think you actually see that in this film a fair amount. We can't really talk about it too much without spoiling the film, but there's this real focus on like the natural world or God or some kind of order inherent to the universe kind of intervening in events over and over again, even down to this clock that dominates the Hudsucker Industries tower. And it's so much a dominant feature that it actually intrudes into the boardrooms, into the offices of the main characters. So the villain and the hero, have their offices next door to each other with the clock mechanism in between, and bits of the clock face kind of intrude into their rooms. And so it's like this idea that time and the universe is pressing in on the characters the whole time.
It's really magical the way that is done, because you see that every so often the minute hand, or maybe the second hand, whatever, kind of coming down the side, and you only see a segment because only a segment is visible at the far end of the office, but it casts this increasingly long shadow as it passes. As you see the hand go like this shadow just extends along the wall, and it's very Fritz Lang, very expressionistic, and it's such a delight to see that kind of simple visual ingenuity in a kind of.
And they invert it. In one of the later scenes, Mussburger is kind of sat gloating in his office at night, and the hand ticks by, but it's neon, it's like lit, and you can actually hear the hum from the neon kind of go by. It's a lovely little bit of set dressing. So we should get on to a thing I like to do on this, which is, if you think about You Should Watch as a series as being about like, well, why should people watch this stuff? Then what individual scene or sequence in the film would you show to someone to recommend it? What would sell the Hudsucker Proxy to a viewer of indietrix?
It is a good question, and a difficult one, because for me, it's packed full of great scenes, and every scene has just so much visual energy going on, and is sort of emblematic of the film in general.
Yeah, I think it is definitely one of those movies where any sequence you picked would be an example of the style, and if you didn't like it then you should just not watch the movie.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's probably fair. Although if you pick as you mentioned, the Jennifer Jason Leigh pastiche might be a bit kind of off-putting for some people, and there is a lot more in the film that is not really Jennifer Jason Leigh related. So if you see one of those scenes, don't necessarily strike it out. But I guess I'd pick two. Well, one scene would be the Sam Raimi directed sequence, the kind of one of the central sequences of the film, which is very funny. But we've already discussed that. I think perhaps early on, the sequence in the boardroom where Hudsucker commits suicide. So we've mentioned this suicide a few times. Worth pointing out that it's sort of, I guess you don't take it seriously because, first of all, it's framed comedically, and second of all, because he's the CEO of this big faceless corporation, and immediately your sympathies, because it's been framed in this sort of Capra-esque way, your sympathies are against big business and for the little man.
We have set a new record in sales, a new record in gross, a new record in pre-tax earnings, a new record in after-tax profits, and our stock is split twice in the past year. In short, we're loaded.
All these big fat white men sitting in suits around this enormous boardroom table, and Hudsucker himself is sitting at the far end. But that scene is quite magical because it sort of has two very distinct halves. The first half is basically what he seems like a sort of footman for the company, the accountant, just reading out the accounts and saying how well everything is going, and gross is up from last year, revenue, profit, yada yada yada. And you sort of every so often the camera switches and then zooms towards Hudsucker himself, and you see his sort of facial expression change, and he looks out the window, and you've got this wonderful kind of push and pull thing with the camera that the Coens often do, which is a sort of zoom from one angle and then a zoom in the opposite direction. And so as you kind of zoom towards Hudsucker's face, you also get a zoom towards the window, as if he's looking out and thinking, he's captivated by something beyond the window. And so when the guy finished doing his accounts, Hudsucker basically winds up his clock, stands on his leather seat, stands on this massive boardroom, does a little sort of dance as if he's getting ready to make a grand sort of physical statement, and then runs towards the window and jumps out of it. Now, everything about this is framed as comedy. And the minute it ends, the film sort of almost develops a sort of new language. Funnily enough, Paul Newman's character, Sidney Mussburger, has not actually been present or visible in this boardroom until Hudsucker jumps out the window. But now he comes on the scene, and the gravity of the film sort of gravitates towards him. And the film develops this musicality. The dialogue develops this musicality that I think is such a joy to watch for anyone that loves musicals, for anyone that loves kind of rat-tat-tat dialogue, where all the dialogue is kind of bouncing off each other. And it has this kind of wonderful rhythm that is sort of ironic because it's taking place in a sort of cold clinical corporate boardroom instead of a sort of more wholesome setting, like I don't know any more wholesome setting you care to mention. And so I like that subversion and just how sort of fun it is to watch.
Yeah, it's a tremendous scene, and it really does set the tone for the film. There's this kind of sense of transgression, I guess, in portraying something like that comedically, but also in just like the simple act of standing on a table always freaks me out. It means you'll do anything once you stand on a table. It's a big move. But his performance there, what's his name? Durning? Warren Durning, I think is his name. Charles Durning. Yeah. His performance there is fantastic, and that facial expression is so interesting because it's this central mystery to the film that the Coen Brothers aren't really interested in at all, but they give it a sense of weight and depth just with that face, because he's like smiling about making enough money, and then something changes, and as you say, it's about him, but there's something beyond, like he's been captured by something. And I'd forgotten about him winding his watch, but of course that ties back in to all the themes in the film about time as well. One thing we didn't talk about, but we should mention briefly, because I kind of had it brought to my attention, is that the film is actually structured to take place narratively over the course of a single day. So although the actual plot of the film runs for about a month, I think it's a month.
Yeah, it's about a month.
It's December, right? It's the entirety of December in 1958.
Yeah.
The actual scenes start in the morning, and then they kind of progress through, and then they go through up until New Year's Eve at night, which is a really clever structural thing to kind of reflect the theme's focus on time and stuff like that. And also there's a slightly circular kind of storytelling to it because it reflects Norville's big idea as well to some extent. That's a tremendous scene and a really great recommendation for it. I think it certainly gives you a sense of the tone of the film. And it's interesting that there isn't really much dialogue before that. You get this kind of drony reading out of the profits and all that stuff, the big business, that whatever it is that Hudsucker does, it's going very well. And then also you have the kind of magical voiceover at the start, but otherwise it's like this kind of percussive sounds. The first moment in the film is when Norville gets off the bus and he's looking at this like automated job ads, which are just like tickers ticking over all the time, and they have a real kind of type sound to them that matches the rhythm of the dialogue, as you were saying later on. And it really is right after his death that you start to see that kind of call and response type speedy dialogue delivery. And then when they're discussing maybe mourning him and then decide not to.
Yeah. Yes. It's great. It's great cinema. I also I'm a big fan of some of the early Jennifer Jason Leigh scenes, the scene where she's first introduced. Before she's introduced, that you get this scene set in a newsroom where this kind of no nonsense editor is obviously incredibly fast talking, because all films that had newspaper rooms in the 30s and 40s were very fast talking, and this newspaper editor is basically hunting for a story. Hudsucker obviously has someone new. Let's get some information on him. What can we do? What do we know? What do we not know? Yada yada yada. And obviously, no one is up to the task really until Amy Archer storms in and basically turns everything on its head by, first of all, being a woman, but also subverting the kind of pitch that the editor is going for. And there's wonderful dialogue throughout this. There's wonderful characterizations. It's quite broad comedy, but it's also very specific in the sense that it's Jennifer Jason Leigh's archetype of this kind of, I think she calls it a fast-talking career gal. That's the kind of trope that's even alluded to in the film itself. Yeah. She has so much fun with it, and everyone else has so much fun with it, and it's really a delight to watch. Again, for its musicality, for its energy, and for sort of how affectionately and sincerely it kind of tries to capture what made those screwball movies, His Girl Friday, and all that sort of thing so great.
Yeah, she walks in, and one of the guys leans over to his mate and says, "I bet she's going to mention her Pulitzer." So like, I bet you a sawbuck or something, and she walks out of the room not having done it, and he sadly hands over this note, and then she storms back in and says, "And I'll bet my Pulitzer on it," and then walks back out again, and the guy's like, "Oh," and gives back the money. Yeah, great. Really nice, kind of like, as you say, broad but specific, playing on something very knowledgeable, but also I think you can watch this film without knowing anything of those other movies. I don't think it loses anything for that. I think there's so much pop cultural osmosis that's around that screwball stuff in terms of how it's like been absorbed. Like I said, if you've watched Gilmore Girls, you get it. So yeah, I think there's plenty to get for the casual movie viewer in the Hudsucker Proxy. And that's probably a good place to stop. So we can finish out there. Arjun, thank you so much for joining me and for recommending this wonderful film.
Thank you so much, Will. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always.
And where can people find your stuff online? Do you have anything you want to plug? You're a good Twitter presence.
Thank you. Often tweet about films and music at ARJSAJ, Arj Saj. I also have a blog that I very occasionally update, and so I was making lots of notes in preparation for this podcast, and I'm sort of, those notes are probably big enough for me to turn into some sort of articles. I'll probably put that up as well. So oldrockingchair.wordpress.com is also where I blog. I guess you can put it on the YouTube description or something. I don't know.
It will go everywhere. Yeah, absolutely. Might even get an on-screen graphic for your Twitter as well. Thanks for listening to me and Arjun chat about the Hudsucker Proxy. And as ever, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the topics discussed throughout. What's your favourite Coen Brothers movie? Are you a Barton Fink fiend, or against all odds, are you somehow a Ladykillers stan? Let's chat in the comments below.